A single mother barely had 50 pesos in her wallet on that blind date, never imagining that from a neighboring table. A millionaire was observing her closely. Jessica checked her purse for the third time under the table, as if the bills could multiply by magic. 50 pesos. That's all she had. The insignificant sum stood in stark contrast to the prices on the menu she held between her trembling fingers in that Polanco restaurant, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Mexico City. "More water, miss?" the waiter asked with a practiced smile. "Yes, thank you," Jessica replied, grateful for the distraction. Anything to delay the moment she'd have to order food. How had she agreed to come here? A blind date that was already 20 minutes late. She sighed as she glanced at her phone. Not even an apology message. Jessica adjusted the collar of her blouse, aware that it was the simplest one in the place. At 32 years old, with her brown hair tied up in an impromptu bun and no makeup beyond a touch of mascara, she felt completely out of place among the tables with white tablecloths and crystal candelabras. It was Daniela's fault, her best friend. "I'll introduce you to someone perfect," she had said. "He's an accountant, has a good job, nothing to lose." And as always, Jessica had given in to please her. When would she learn? She couldn't afford these luxuries, not with Mateo waiting at home with a babysitter, to whom she already owed 2 weeks' payment. From a neighboring table, dark and piercing eyes observed her. Marcos Almeida, 42 years old, in an impeccable navy suit and a white shirt without a tie, had noticed every nervous movement of the woman. He noticed how she carefully unfolded a napkin over her lap with excessive care. He noticed how her eyes scanned the menu and suppressed a gesture of surprise at the prices. He noticed the distress in her eyes when she checked her purse. Marcos looked away when his assistant handed him a document to sign. It was the third contract of the week, another property acquired for his growing real estate empire. The signature was automatic, without enthusiasm. The waiter approached to refill his glass of wine, an imported Cabernet that cost more than the shoes of the woman at the neighboring table. "Would you like to order now, Mr. Almeida?" the waiter asked deferentially. "Not yet," Marcos replied without looking up from his tablet, where he was reviewing stock market quotes. Numbers, always numbers. Numbers that kept rising but didn't fill the emptiness of a Santa Fe penthouse. Meanwhile, Jessica sipped her water in small sips, stretching out the time. Her phone buzzed, and she nearly knocked it over in her haste to grab it. "I'm sorry," the message read. "Something came up at the office. Impossible to get away. Can we reschedule?" A knot formed in her throat. She had taken time off work, paid the babysitter, taken 2 collectivos to get here, and all for this. Her eyes welled up, but she took a deep breath. She wouldn't cry in public, never. Ready to order? The waiter had returned, notepad in hand. Jessica hesitated, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "Actually, I'm waiting for someone who just canceled. I think I'll just pay for the water. The lady is with me." A deep voice interrupted from the neighboring table. Jessica turned, startled. The man in the blue suit was looking directly at her, his dark eyes holding an unreadable expression. He wasn't smiling, but there was something in his gaze that left her frozen. "Mr. Almeida, I didn't know you were expecting company," the waiter said, clearly confused. "It's a surprise," Marcos replied naturally. "Could you join our tables?" The waiter nodded, efficient as always, and within seconds, Jessica found herself face to face with a complete stranger. A stranger who, by the way he was treated by the staff, seemed to be someone important. "It's not necessary," Jessica whispered, uncomfortable. "Really, I was about to leave." 50 pesos won't get you far from Polanco," he said in a low voice, looking at her intently. "Besides, you're already here. It would be a shame to waste the evening." Jessica felt the color drain from her face. How did he know? "Don't be alarmed," Marcos continued, softening his expression slightly. "I saw you checking your purse. I'm observant by nature. My name is Marcos Almeida." "Jessica Reyes," she replied automatically, still dazed by the situation. "Look, Mr. Almeida, I appreciate your kindness, but I don't accept invitations from strangers." "Then let's stop being strangers," he said, extending a hand across the table. "I'm the owner of Almeida Construcciones. I'm 42 years old, divorced for 5 years, No children. I like red wine, classic cars, and authentic people. Your turn. Jessica couldn't help but let a small smile form on her lips at his direct introduction. 32 years old. Single mother of a 6-year-old boy named Mateo, she said, surprising herself with her honesty. I work as a graphic designer at a small agency. I like cafe con leche, used books, and people who don't pretend to be something they're not. Marcos nodded as if approving her response. The waiter returned with the menu, and Jessica felt the panic rise again at the astronomical prices. Order whatever you want, Marcos said, reading her expression. If it makes you feel better, consider an exchange. You give me the gift of your company on a night that was going to be boring, and I'll treat you to dinner. Do you always invite strangers to dinner? Jessica asked, half amused, half intrigued. Only when I see something that interests me, he replied, holding her gaze. Jessica felt a flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. This man was dangerous, not threatening, but in the way he looked at her, as if he truly saw her. And what do you see, Mr. Almeida? She dared ask. A woman who's pretending she's not scared, he answered without hesitation. Who's probably had a tough day, who shouldn't be here but came to please someone else. A woman who thinks of a child waiting at home before she thinks of herself. Jessica was left speechless. The precision of his analysis completely disarmed her. Do you always analyze strangers like this? She asked finally. Only the interesting ones, Marcos replied, and for the first time, a slight smile transformed his stern face. The waiter returned with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. Jessica hesitated. I can't drink much, she explained. I have to get home to my son. Respectable, Marcos said, gesturing to the waiter. Bring the lady whatever she'd like to drink. A mineral water with lemon will be fine, Jessica ordered. The dinner continued with a strange mix of discomfort and mutual fascination. Jessica learned that Marcos had built his empire from scratch, starting as a bricklayer on his father's construction sites. He listened as she shared how she had finished college while working and raising a baby after Mateo's father disappeared upon learning of the pregnancy. Why help a stranger? Jessica finally asked when dessert arrived. There are dozens of women in tough situations every day. Marcos remained silent for a moment, as if carefully considering his response. My mother was a single mother, he said finally. She worked cleaning other people's houses, so I could study. She never had anyone to lend her a hand when she needed it. The confession, so personal and unexpected, created an invisible bridge between them. Jessica nodded, understanding the weight of those words perfectly. Besides, Marcos added with a glint in his eyes, not everyone maintains their dignity with 50 pesos in their wallet and a 500 peso per dish menu in their hands. Jessica laughed, the first genuine laugh of the night. Dignity is free, she replied, though it's not always easy to keep. As the clock ticked on, Jessica felt an unexpected connection with this man of stern appearance but sincere words. It wasn't a date. It wasn't a romantic encounter. Yet there was more authenticity in this impromptu dinner than in any interaction she'd had in years. At the end, Marcos insisted on driving her home. His driver was waiting outside in a black Mercedes that stood out starkly against a modest Iztapalapa neighborhood where Jessica lived. You don't need to walk me to the door, she said when the car stopped in front of the small apartment building. My mother taught me to be a gentleman, Marcos replied seriously. Besides, I want to make sure you get home safely. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, no elevator. Jessica climbed the stairs, aware of Marcos' presence behind her, his expensive cologne mingling with the building's damp smell. The babysitter, a young college student from the floor above, greeted them with sleepy eyes that widened in surprise upon seeing Jessica's companion. Mateo fell asleep an hour ago, the girl reported. He was an angel, as always. Thank you, Anna, Jessica said, reaching into her purse. I'll pay you next week. It's already paid, Marcos interrupted, and both women looked at him in surprise. I gave the money to the doorman when we came in. 2 weeks' worth, as you mentioned during dinner. Jessica felt a mix of gratitude and irritation. She didn't want charity, but she couldn't deny that the gesture lifted an enormous weight off her shoulders. I'll pay you back, she said firmly. Anna discreetly said goodbye, leaving them alone in the small living room. "Can I see Mateo?" Marcos asked suddenly. "Just for a moment. I've always liked watching kids sleep. They have a piece we adults have forgotten." The request was unusual, but Jessica nodded, leading him to the small bedroom where Mateo slept soundly. The dim light of a dinosaur lamp illuminated his serene face, his long lashes like his mother's, his breathing calm. Marcos watched him in silence, his expression unreadable to Jessica. "Nostalgia, sadness," Jessica whispered. "He's a good boy." "The best," Marcos replied softly. "He looks like you. He has your same determined expression, even in his sleep." They left the room, and Jessica knew the night had come to an end. A strange, unexpected night that had begun with embarrassment and ended with this inexplicable connection with a man who belonged to a completely different world. "Thank you for dinner," she said, extending her hand formally, "and for the ride and the babysitter. I'll pay you back, I promise." Marcos took her hand, but instead of shaking it, held it between his for a moment longer than necessary. "I'd like to see you again, Jessica," he said with that direct sincerity that seemed to define him. "And Mateo, too. Maybe a Sunday in the park. Something more suitable for him." Jessica felt her heart race. Was this real? A man like him wanted to spend time with a single mother from Iztapalapa and her 6-year-old son. "Why?" she asked, needing to understand. "Because in a world where everyone pretends you're real," he replied simply, "and that's more valuable than any bank account." When Marcos finally left, Jessica closed the door and leaned against it, trying to process everything that had happened. In her pocket, she found a card with Marcos' name and his personal number scribbled on the back. That night, as she watched Mateo sleep, Jessica wondered if she should call him. A world separated their realities. Yet for the first time in a long time, she felt it might be worth taking a chance. What had started as a humiliation had ended as an encounter that could change everything. 50 pesos in her wallet and a heart willing to be brave again. Maybe that was enough to start. For 3 days, Jessica had stared at the card strategically placed next to the frame with Mateo's photo on the kitchen shelf. Every morning, as she prepared breakfast for her son, her eyes drifted to that small white rectangle with gold lettering. "Marcos Almeida, CEO, Almeida Construcciones." "Who's that man from the restaurant you keep talking about, Mom?" Mateo asked that morning while nibbling on his bread with cajeta, swinging his legs that didn't yet reach the floor. Jessica smiled. News traveled fast in the building. "Just an acquaintance," she replied, pouring more milk into his glass. "Do you have your homework ready for today?" Mateo nodded enthusiastically, but didn't let the topic drop so easily. "Do you like him?" he asked with the blunt honesty only children possess. "I'd like to have a dad like Diego's dad. He takes him to Chapultepec every Sunday." Jessica felt a lump in her throat. Sometimes she forgot how much her son observed, how much he understood despite his 6 years. "It's not that simple, my love," she said, ruffling his hair. "Besides, you and I are doing fine, right? We're a great team." "The best team," Mateo confirmed, fist bumping his mother. But reinforcement wouldn't hurt. Jessica laughed at the soccer term. On Saturdays, she and Mateo watched games together, a tradition that started so he could have something masculine in his life, as her grandmother put it, but had become their favorite shared activity. After dropping Mateo off at school, Jessica arrived at the agency where she worked, a small but bright space in the Roma neighborhood, where 4 designers squeeze into desks cluttered with samples and computers. "And here comes a fairy tale princess," exclaimed Roberto, her desk mate, with a mischievous grin. "Daniela told us everything. A millionaire rescuing you in the middle of a fancy restaurant. What a soap opera." Jessica rolled her eyes as she turned on her computer. "Don't exaggerate. He was just being nice," she replied, though she couldn't stop her cheeks from flushing. "And why haven't you called him?" Daniela asked, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. "It's been 3 days. The man must be glued to his phone waiting." "Men like him don't wait for women like me," Jessica replied, accepting the coffee. It was a nice gesture, nothing more. "My cousin works in real estate and says Almeida Construcciones is worth millions." Carlos, the 3rd designer, chimed in. The guy literally builds half of Santa Fe. And so what? Jessica was starting to get irritated. Do you think he's looking for a serious relationship with a single mom from Iztapalapa? It was probably, I don't know, a charity act for his conscience. A charity act that looks at you like you're the most delicious dessert on the menu? Daniela asked, raising an eyebrow. Anna told me the way he looked at you. You talked to my babysitter? Jessica nearly choked on her coffee. I live 3 blocks from your building, remember? Daniela said. I ran into her at the corner store. Jessica sighed deeply. Her private life had never been so widely discussed. We have the craft brewery project to finish today, she said, deliberately changing the subject. And I need to leave on time to pick up Mateo. The day passed with vectors, color palettes, and calls from dissatisfied clients. But the image of Marcos Almeida crept into every task, like a persistent thought that wouldn't let go. It was absurd to feel this way about a man she barely knew, a man whose watch probably cost more than 6 months of her salary, a man who belonged to a world of million-dollar contracts, fancy restaurants, and decisions that affected hundreds of people. At 5 p.m., Jessica picked up Mateo from school. They walked together to the Colectivo stop, with the boy excitedly recounting every detail of his day. And then the teacher said my drawing was the best in the class. Mateo concluded proudly. She put it on the wall of highlights. That's wonderful, my love, Jessica replied, genuinely proud. You're an artist like your mom. That's when she saw it. The same black Mercedes parked discreetly a few meters from the stop, and leaning against it, with a calm but vigilant expression, was Marcos Almeida. Jessica stopped dead in her tracks. Mateo, following her gaze, asked, Is that him? The man from the restaurant. Marcos approached with purposeful but cautious steps, as if afraid of startling them. He was dressed more casually than the first time. Dark jeans, a blue shirt rolled up to the elbows, and sunglasses that he removed as he reached them. Hello, Jessica, he greeted in his deep voice before crouching slightly toward Mateo. And you must be the famous Mateo. Your mom told me a lot about you. The boy, usually shy with strangers, flashed an instant smile. Are you the one with the big car? He asked without filter. Marcos smiled, a smile that transformed his serious face into something warm and approachable. Yes, that's me. My name is Marcos. What are you doing here? Jessica interjected, recovering from the surprise. How did you know where? The school's on the business card you gave me, he explained naturally. Graphic designer at Colores Vivos, or Azaba Street. I called the agency. They said you'd left to pick up your son. The closest school is this one. Jessica didn't know whether to feel flattered or unsettled by his thoroughness. That's pretty detailed, she commented finally. When something interests me, I'm persistent, Marcos replied, looking her straight in the eyes. Mateo watched the exchange with fascination, his eyes darting between them like he was watching a tennis match. I told you you'd call, Marcos continued. It's been 3 days. I decided to take the initiative. I was busy, Jessica defended herself weakly. Too busy to use a phone? He asked with a half smile that suggested he didn't buy her excuse. I understand if you're not interested. Just say so, and I won't bother you again. His blunt honesty continued to unsettle her. There were no games, no masks, just this raw sincerity that completely disarmed her. It's not that, Jessica admitted, lowering her guard. It's just that our worlds are very different. Can we talk in the car? Marco suggested, gesturing toward the Mercedes where the driver waited patiently. I'll take you home. Yes, Mateo exclaimed before his mother could respond. I've never been in a Mercedes. Jessica sighed, defeated by her son's enthusiasm. Just a ride home, she agreed. Once inside the luxurious vehicle, Mateo was mesmerized by the leather seats, electric windows, and the small built-in fridge from which Marcos pulled out a juice for him. Is this yours? The boy asked wide-eyed. All of it. The company is mine, Marcos replied as the car started moving. We build buildings, houses, shopping centers. Like giant blocks? Mateo reasoned, nodding seriously. Exactly like giant blocks, Marcos confirmed, clearly pleased with the comparison. Jessica watched the interaction in silence, surprised by the ease with which this man, accustomed to leading board meetings and signing million-dollar contracts, converse with 6-year-old. "I was thinking of inviting you both to Sunday," Marco said, turning to Jessica. "There's a festival in Xochimilco, music, food, crafts. Something fun for Mateo and for us." "Trajineras!" Mateo exclaimed. "I want to ride one, please, Mom." Jessica looked at her son, so excited, and then at Marcos, whose expectant expression revealed more vulnerability than he probably intended to show. "Why are you doing this?" she asked in a low voice while Mateo was distracted with the armrest buttons. "Why not?" Marcos replied simply. "I like you, Jessica. Not just physically. I like your dignity, your strength, the way you look at your son. It's refreshing to meet someone real in a world where everything feels like a transaction. And what do you expect from this?" she pressed. "I'm a single mom with a modest job. You're a man alone at the top of a mountain of commitments and expectations. A man who builds buildings for others but doesn't have a real home," he completed. "A man tired of women who approach me for what I have, not for who I am." The confession, so honest and devoid of self-pity, touched something within Jessica. "I'm not a charity project," she warned, keeping up her last defensive barrier. "I don't need anyone to save us." "I know," he replied with a genuine smile. "That's exactly what draws me to you." The car stopped in front of Jessica's building. Mateo had already unbuckled his seatbelt, eager to tell Anna about his ride in the Mercedes. "So Xochimilco Sunday?" Marcos asked, his tone blending authority and hope. "I'll pick you up at 10. Jessica looked at Mateo, who was watching her with pleading eyes, and then at Marcos, whose intensity seemed to pierce all her barriers. 10 o'clock, she agreed finally. As they climbed the stairs to their apartment, Mateo bounced with excitement. "Did you see, Mom?" he said with a wisdom beyond his years. "When you were sad because they stood you up, the universe sent you something better. My teacher says that's how things work." Jessica smiled, touched by the simplicity with which her son saw the world. That night, as Mateo slept, Jessica opened her laptop and, giving in to curiosity, searched for information about Marcos Almeida. The news confirmed what she already knew: a successful, discreet, but influential businessman, known for his innovative projects and work ethic. What caught her attention most was an interview where he talked about growing up in Nezahualcóyotl in poverty and how his mother had sacrificed everything for his education. He wasn't just an eccentric millionaire seeking an adventure. He was a man who, like her, knew sacrifice and struggle, a man who had crossed the invisible line separating Mexico's two worlds but hadn't forgotten his roots. For the first time in years, Jessica felt a mix of hope and fear. Hope for the possibility of a genuine connection. Fear of how much she and Mateo could get hurt if this didn't work out. On her phone, a text message glowed on the screen. "Thank you for agreeing. Rest well, Jessica." Simple, direct, like everything about Marcos Almeida. Jessica replied before she could second-guess herself. "Thank you for insisting." As she turned off the apartment's lights, Jessica thought that maybe, just maybe, those 50 pesos in her wallet on the night of the failed date had been the ticket to something unexpected. Not a Cinderella story, not a fairy tale, but something more authentic. The possibility of a new beginning based not on need or convenience, but on the mutual recognition of two souls who, despite their differences, spoke the same language. The Sunday in Xochimilco would be the first chapter of that possibility. Sunday dawned clear, as if the weather itself wanted to favor the Xochimilco outing. Jessica woke before her alarm, a mix of anxiety and anticipation she hadn't felt since her teenage years. She lay staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom, listening to the familiar sounds of the building. The neighbor's radio upstairs, the barking dog in 2B, the clinking of Dona Lupita's pots as she prepared breakfast. At 7 a.m., Mateo burst into her room like a whirlwind of energy. "Today we're going to Trajineras," he exclaimed, jumping onto his mother's bed. "Do you think we'll see axolotls? My teacher says there are in 8061 aren't many left, but sometimes you can see them in the farther channels." Jessica smiled, infected by her son's enthusiasm. "I don't know, my love, but it'll definitely be fun," she replied, ruffling his hair. "Now go shower. We need to be ready." The morning passed with preparations. Jessica hesitated for a long time in front of her closet, aware of how absurd it was to worry so much about clothes for a Chagina ride, where they'd inevitably get splashed. She finally settled on comfortable jeans, a simple but elegant white blouse, and low sandals, nothing pretentious, but not careless either. At 9:45, Mateo was already by the window, watching the street. "Do you think he'll bring the same car?" he asked for the third time. "I don't know, Mateo," Jessica replied, trying to sound nonchalant while checking her bag. Sunscreen, a change of clothes for Mateo, money. This time she would drawn enough from the bank to not feel at a disadvantage. Her wallet, keys. At exactly 10, the intercom buzzed. Jessica flinched involuntarily, and Mateo ran to answer. "We're coming!" he shouted into the intercom without waiting for a response. On the street, Marcos was waiting next to a different vehicle. Not the formal black Mercedes, but a more adventurous 4x4 truck. He was dressed differently, too. Cargo pants, a rolled-up linen shirt, and sunglasses. "Good morning," he greeted with a smile as they emerged from the building. "Ready for the adventure?" Mateo nodded vigorously, approaching to inspect the vehicle. "Where's your other car?" he asked bluntly. "That one's for work," Marcos explained. "This one's for fun." Jessica watched the exchange, surprised once again by how naturally this man communicated with her son, without condescension or the forced tone many adults use with children. "Good morning," she greeted, offering a cautious smile. "No driver today?" "I'm driving," Marcos replied, opening the back door for Mateo. "Sundays are mine, no assistants, no employees, just me." There was something liberating in his tone, as if these Sunday escapes were his lifeline in a sea of responsibilities. The drive to Xochimilco was marked by Mateo's incessant questions and Marcos' patient answers. Jessica watched, increasingly intrigued by this man who seemed as comfortable explaining car engines as he was answering why the sky is blue or how trigeneras work. "Mom says you're a builder," Mateo commented at one point. "That's right," Marcos confirmed, glancing at the boy through the rear-view mirror. "We build buildings, houses, offices." "Why?" Mateo pressed with the boundless curiosity of a 6-year-old. Marcos seemed to reflect seriously on the question. "Because when I was a kid, we lived in a tiny house where water came in when it rained," he answered finally. "My mom always said one day we'd have a house where we wouldn't get wet when it rained. I think that's why I started building places where people feel safe." The simplicity of the response, so honest and free of pretense, moved Jessica. He didn't talk about financial success, corporate empires, or prestige. He spoke of his mother and a house that didn't leak. "Our house isn't very big either," Mateo commented. "But it doesn't leak when it rains, just makes noise on the roof." "Then it's a good home," Marcos affirmed, exchanging a look with Jessica through the mirror. Xochimilco greeted them with its characteristic Sunday bustle. Families carrying coolers of food, vendors offering flowers and candy, musicians with instruments seeking clients among the trigeneras. The aroma of roasted corn and freshly made quesadillas filled the air. "Have you been here before?" Marcos asked Jessica as they walked toward the dock. "Years ago," she replied. "My dad used to bring us when I was little. Then, well, life gets complicated, and these places become for tourists or special occasions." Marcos nodded, understanding the subtext. In Mexico City, even the most ingrained traditions could become luxuries for many families. They didn't have to wait in line. A weathered-looking man approached Marcos immediately, greeting him with familiarity. "Don Marcos, what a pleasure to see you," he said, shaking his hand. "Your trigenera is ready as always." Jessica raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Do you come often?" she asked as they followed the man to a side dock, away from the main bustle. "Once a month or so," Marcos replied softly. "I like the calm of the water, the different rhythm. Here, no one comes looking for me to sign documents or solve crises." The trigenera waiting for them was different from the typical tourist boats. Smaller, more elegant, with comfortable seats and a polished wooden table. The name Esperanza was painted in gold letters on the bright green edge. "Why Esperanza?" Jessica asked as she helped Mateo board. "It was my mother's name," Marcos replied with a softness he hadn't shown before. She passed away 3 years ago. I'm sorry, Jessica said sincerely. She had a good life, he replied, regaining his composure. I managed to give her everything she deserved. She lived to see her son no longer got wet when it rained. As the Tragenera glided through the canals, moving away from the more crowded areas, Jessica watched as Marcos pointed out different plants and birds to Mateo, explaining the ecosystem's peculiarities with patience. Her son, usually restless, listened with unusual attention, absorbing every word. Do you like nature? Jessica asked when Mateo got distracted feeding bread to the ducks. My mother used to say a man should know both books and the earth, Marcos replied. When I landed my first big contract, the first thing I did was buy her a house with a garden. She planted every tree, every flower with her own hands. She said that after cleaning other people's houses her whole life, tending her own garden was her way of freedom. Jessica nodded, recognizing in that story echoes of her own struggles, the dignity found in small victories, in conquered spaces. Mateo has your eyes, Marcos commented, changing the subject. That way of observing everything, analyzing it. He's much braver than I am, Jessica replied. At his age, I was shy, fearful. He faces the world like it belongs to him. That's because he has a mother who teaches him the world can be his, Marcos said with a certainty that left no room for doubt. Lunch was served by the boatman. Tacos, quesadillas, guacamole, all prepared on the spot on a small portable grill. Mateo ate with the voracious appetite of childhood, getting green salsa on his cheeks. This is better than the fancy restaurant, right, Mom? He commented between bites. Jessica laughed, remembering her disastrous almost date the week before. Much better, she confirmed, surprised to realize she meant it. Marcos watched them with an expression hard to interpret. There was warmth in his dark eyes, but also something deeper, almost melancholic. What are you thinking about? Jessica dared to ask when Mateo got distracted exploring the front of the Tragenera with the boatman. How strange fate is, Marcos replied after a moment. If your date had shown up that night, we'd never have spoken. If you'd had enough money to pay the bill, you probably would have left without looking at me twice. If I'd been a waiter instead of the important client, you probably wouldn't have noticed me either, Jessica added, feeling the need to balance the equation. Marcos shook his head. I would have noticed you, he said with that quiet confidence that defined him. There are people who light up the spaces they occupy, Jessica. It has nothing to do with the clothes they wear or the last names they carry. His words, spoken without affectation, caused a wave of warmth in Jessica's chest. It wasn't a rehearsed compliment, but an honest observation. The sunset arrived with orange and pink hues reflecting on the calm water. Mateo, exhausted after hours of exploration and play, had fallen asleep on one of the seats, covered with the light jacket Marcos had lent him. We should head back, Jessica said, stroking her sleeping son's hair. He has school tomorrow. Of course, Marcos nodded, signaling the boatman. The return was quiet, comfortable, as if they had shared many more Sundays together. As the Tragenera approached the dock, now much less crowded, Jessica felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. The day had been perfect, almost unreal in its simplicity and beauty. Thank you, she said, looking directly at Marcos. Mateo enjoyed it so much. And you? He asked, holding her gaze. Me too, Jessica admitted. It's been a long time since I felt so present, so in the moment. Marcos nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Time takes on a different value when you share it with the right people, he commented, helping her gently wake Mateo. The boy opened his eyes, disoriented for a moment, but smiled when he recognized Marcos. Did we see axolotls? He asked sleepily. Not yet, champ, Marcos replied with a smile. Maybe another time. Promise? Mateo insisted, extending his pinky. Jessica held her breath, aware of the weight of that simple childish request. It wasn't just a promise for another outing. It was an implicit promise of continuity, of a future. Marcos, however, didn't hesitate. He hooked his pinky with Mateo's in that solemn pact all children consider sacred. Promise, he confirmed. As they walked back to the truck, Mateo between them, occasionally taking both their hands, Jessica felt a pang of fear, not for Marcos or his intentions, but for how quickly she and her son were getting used to his presence, how easy it was to imagine more days like this. The ride home was comfortable silence, interrupted only by Mateo's rhythmic breathing, as he fell back asleep as soon as the truck started moving. Jessica watched Marcos' profile as he drove, the defined jaw, the focus in his eyes, the steady hands on the wheel. It was strange to feel so at ease with someone who, a week ago, was a complete stranger. "It's been a perfect day," she commented when traffic briefly stopped them on Periferico. "I don't remember the last time Mateo had so much fun." "Neither do I," Marcos replied with a faint smile. Jessica looked at him, intrigued by the response. "What do you mean?" Marcos hesitated, as if deciding how much to reveal. "My life is full of meetings, reports, decisions that affect hundreds of people," he explained finally. "Fun is usually scheduled, events, galas, business dinners disguised as leisure. And today?" Jessica asked. "Today? I felt like when I was a kid and my mom managed to scrape together enough to take us to the park," he replied with an honesty that disarmed her. "Simple, real?" Jessica nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Authenticity was scarce in a world where everything seemed calculated, even emotions. When they reached the building, Marcos insisted on helping carry Mateo to the apartment. The boy, exhausted, barely stirred as his mother changed his clothes and tucked him into bed. Jessica left the room quietly, finding Marcos standing by the small photo shelf in the living room. "He's a spitting image of you," he commented, pointing to a photo of Jessica holding newborn Mateo. "His nose is his father's," she replied automatically, then regretted mentioning the absent man. Marcos looked at her with curiosity, but didn't pry. Another thing Jessica appreciated about him: he didn't push, didn't demand stories she wasn't ready to share. "Want a coffee?" she offered, trying to normalize the situation. "It's not imported Italian or anything fancy." "I'd love one," Marcos accepted, taking off his light jacket and draping it over a chair. Jessica's kitchen was small but functional. As she prepared the coffee in a traditional coffee maker, she felt Marcos' presence behind her, leaning against the doorframe, watching her. "What?" she asked, slightly nervous under his intense gaze. "I was thinking how different my life would have been if my mother had met someone like you," he replied with disarming frankness. Someone who fought for a child with so much dignity and love. The unexpected declaration left Jessica momentarily speechless. She finally served the coffee in 2 mismatched ceramic mugs and handed him one. "I'm no heroine," she said, sitting at the small table. "I just do what any mother would." "We both know that's not true," Marcos countered, sitting across from her. "I've seen too many parents abandon their responsibilities at the first hurdle." Jessica knew he spoke from experience. His absent father, Mateo's father, gone at the news of the pregnancy. "Why didn't you have children?" she dared to ask, steering the conversation away from herself. Marcos took a sip of coffee before answering. "My marriage was a strategic mistake," he said finally. "We wanted different things. She wanted my name and status. I wanted the family I never had." "I'm sorry," Jessica murmured. "Don't be," he replied with a resigned smile. "I learned my lesson. Relationships can't be built on hidden transactions." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Jessica felt they were on the brink of something important, but she didn't know how to take the next step. "Jessica," Marcos began with a seriousness that made her hold her breath, "I don't want any misunderstandings between us. I like you and I think you like me, but I understand perfectly that your priority is Mateo, as it should be." "Mateo is my life," she confirmed. "Anyone who enters my world has to understand that." "I know," Marcos nodded, "and I respect that deeply. That's why I want to be clear. If you decide you want to explore this, whatever it is we're building, I need you to know I'm serious." "What do you mean by serious?" Jessica asked, her heart racing. "I'm not looking for an adventure or a pastime," Marcos replied, looking her straight in the eyes. "I'm 42 years old, Jessica. I've built an empire of concrete and steel, but I come home to an empty penthouse every night. I'm not looking to fill a temporary slot in my schedule." The brutal honesty of his words moved her. There were no pretensions, no games, just this raw truth between them. We barely know each other, Jessica pointed out, trying to keep her feet on the ground. 1 week, Marcos. A dinner and a trip. And yet, I feel like I know you better than people I've worked with for years, he replied. I'm not saying we need to make decisions now. I just want you to know where I'm looking when I think about us. Us. The word echoed in Jessica's mind like both a promise and a warning. I'm scared, she admitted finally, lowering her guard completely. Not just for me. Mateo's already getting attached to you. If this doesn't work. If it doesn't work, I'll still be respectful and clear with both of you, Marcos interrupted. I won't disappear without explanations. I won't hurt you deliberately. That I can promise. Jessica looked at him, searching his eyes for any sign of doubt or falsehood. She found none. What will your partners, your friends, say when they find out you're dating a graphic designer from Iztapalapa? She asked, voicing one of her deepest fears. Marcos smiled, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was one of understanding. The same ones who whispered when the cleaning lady's son became their boss. He replied simply, Their opinions stopped mattering to me a long time ago, Jessica. They sat in silence, the coffee cooling in their hands. Through the kitchen window, the city lights flickered like fallen stars. I'm going to be honest with you, Jessica said finally. I like you. I like how you treat Mateo, how you look at me. But I have to be cautious, mostly for him. I understand, Marcos nodded. You need time, she continued. I need us to go slowly to really get to know each other. All the time you need, he conceded, his voice carrying a reassuring certainty. I'm not in a hurry, Jessica. What I'm looking for is worth the wait. When Marcos finally said goodbye, he didn't try to kiss her. Instead, he took her hand and held it between his, a simple but intimate gesture. Thank you for today, he said. And in those 3 words, Jessica felt there was more than gratitude for a shared Sunday. Thank you, she replied, for everything. She meant more than the trip, more than the perfect day. She meant his honesty, his clarity, the way he made her feel seen and valued without pretense. After Marcos left, Jessica closed the door and leaned against it, just as she had a week earlier, the night he'd driven her home after that unexpected dinner. But this time, there was no confusion or disbelief in her chest. There was a warm certainty and a fear she couldn't ignore. She peeked into Mateo's room, watching his steady breathing, his small hands clutching a dinosaur plush toy. Every decision she made affected him, too. Every person she let into her life entered his as well. That night, before going to bed, Jessica took her phone and sent a simple message. Thank you for a day, Mateo, and I will always remember. Good night, Marcos. The reply came almost instantly, the first of many, if you both allow it. Rest well, Jessica, the first of many. The words danced in her mind as sleep slowly claimed her. There was truth in them and promise, and a future that a week ago would have seemed impossible. In the weeks that followed, Marcos became a constant but respectful presence in their lives. There were no ostentatious gestures or extravagant gifts, but meaningful details that showed attention and care. A dinosaur book for Mateo, found in a used bookstore. A plant for Jessica's apartment because she'd mentioned wanting a small garden like her grandmother's in Puebla. Sundays became special days. Sometimes they were simple outings, a park, a museum, a walk through Coyoacán. Other times, more elaborate adventures, a day in Teotihuacan, a trip to see the monarch butterflies, a weekend in Tepoztlán, where Marcos rented a cabin with a view of the mountains. Jessica watched with awe and cautious hope as Mateo blossomed under the masculine attention he'd never had before. Marcos was patient, firm when needed, but also playful and genuinely interested in the boy's ideas and questions. He didn't try to buy his affection with expensive gifts, but earned it with time and attention. In mid-April, after nearly 2 months of this new dynamic, Jessica received a call that would change everything. She was at the agency, finishing campaign design, when Roberto handed her phone with a worried expression. It's Mateo's school, he said quietly. Jessica's heart skipped a beat as she took the receiver. Hello, Mrs. Reyes, came the voice. This is Principal Guzman. There's been an incident with Mateo. He's fine, but we need you to come immediately. What happened? Jessica asked, panic rising in her chest. I'd prefer to discuss it in person, the principal replied in a tone that brooked no argument. As soon as possible, please. Jessica hung up, dazed. Her boss, seeing her expression, told her to leave immediately. As she hurriedly gathered her things, Jessica dialed Marcos' number almost without thinking. Jessica, he answered on the first ring. It's Mateo, she said, her voice trembling. Something happened at school. They won't tell me what, but I have to go now. There was no hesitation, no unnecessary questions. I'm in a meeting in Reforma, Marcos said calmly. Can I be at the school in 15 minutes? I'll pick you up on the way. Jessica felt a wave of gratitude at his immediate, practical response. I'm leaving the office now, she replied. I'll see you there. As she waited for the collectivo, her heart pounding against her ribs, Jessica realized something fundamental. In a moment of crisis, her instinct had been to call Marcos without hesitation, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to turn to him when Mateo was in trouble. The collectivo moved maddeningly slowly through traffic, but for the first time in 6 years, Jessica wouldn't face an emergency involving her son alone. And that certainty, amidst the anxiety, was like a beacon in the dark. When Jessica arrived at the school, Marcos was already there, standing by his truck, a calm presence that contrasted with her own panic. He was in the formal suit he wore for important meetings, but he'd loosened his tie and unbuttoned the top of his shirt, as if he'd left in a hurry. I just got here, he said as they walked together toward the entrance. I haven't gone in yet. Thank you for coming so quickly, Jessica murmured, grateful for his reassuring presence. Always, Marcos replied simply, placing a hand on the small of her back in protective gesture that felt surprisingly natural. The secretary recognized him immediately and led them to principal's office, where Mateo sat in a chair too big for him, head down, a visible scrape on his right cheek. Mateo, Jessica exclaimed, rushing to her son and kneeling in front of him. Are you okay? What happened? The boy looked up, and Jessica saw he'd been crying. His eyes brightened slightly when he saw Marcos behind her. You came, Mateo said, looking at him with surprise and something like relief. Of course, Marcos replied naturally, as if it couldn't be any other way. Principal Guzman, a woman in her 50s with stern but fair demeanor, observed the scene with an evaluative expression. Her eyes darted between Jessica and Marcos several times before she spoke. Mrs. Reyes, thank you for coming so quickly, she said formally, then directed a questioning look at Marcos. Marcos Almeida, he introduced himself, extending his hand. He paused almost imperceptibly, Jessica's partner. Jessica felt a small jolt at the declaration. It was the first time Marcos had defined their relationship that way, and he'd done it in the most unexpected context. I see, the principal replied, shaking his hand. Please take a seat. Once seated, the principal adopted a more serious expression. There was an altercation during recess, she explained. Mateo struck another student, specifically Javier Dominguez from 3rd grade. Jessica looked at her son in disbelief. Mateo had never been violent. He was quiet, sometimes too serious for his age, but never aggressive. Mateo, is that true? She asked gently. The boy nodded without lifting his gaze. Why? Marcos interjected, his tone not accusatory, but genuinely curious. Mateo stayed silent for a moment before answering in a low voice. He said bad things about Mom. Jessica felt her blood run cold. The principal cleared her throat uncomfortably. According to witnesses, the woman continued, young Dominguez made inappropriate comments about Mateo's family situation and insinuations about his mother. What kind of insinuations? Marcos asked. Though his tone remained calm, Jessica sensed a new tension in his posture. He suggested that Mrs. Reyes was, the principal searched for appropriate words, interested in Mr. Almeida for financial reasons. Apparently, Javier's parents are friends of the Mendez family. Daniela, Jessica murmured, recalling that her friend, who had arranged a failed blind date, was the sister-in-law of the Mendez family. Rumors fly, the principal commented with resignation, especially in circles where everyone knows each other. What exactly did he say? Marcos insisted, now with a barely contained edge in his voice. Mateo looked up, a mix of shame and wounded pride in his eyes. He said my mom was a... The boy hesitated, clearly uncomfortable repeating the words. A gold digger who slept with rich men to support us. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with contained indignation. Jessica felt breathless. Humiliation mixed with anger in her chest. I understand Mateo's anger, the principal continued, breaking the heavy silence. But in this institution, we do not tolerate physical violence under any circumstances. Of course, Jessica nodded, regaining her composure. Mateo knows he shouldn't solve problems with fists, right, my love? The boy nodded, though not very convincingly. Given the provocation, and considering this is Mateo's first offense, there will be no suspension, the principal conceded. But he will need to offer an apology to Javier. And Javier? Marcos asked with a dangerous calm. He'll also apologize for defaming Mrs. Reyes. The principal seemed momentarily taken aback. Javier's behavior will also be addressed, Mr. Almeida. His parents have been summoned for tomorrow. Good, Marcos said, standing with deliberate slowness, because I'm sure you understand that defamation is a crime, especially when it involves a minor and affect their family environment. His tone wasn't threatening, but it clearly conveyed that this wasn't a casual remark. The principal nodded, visibly impressed by the presence and authority Marcos projected. Of course, Mr. Almeida. We'll treat this incident with the seriousness it deserves. Minutes later, the three walked to the parking lot in silence. Jessica held Mateo's hand tightly, as if afraid he might vanish. When they reached the truck, Marcos crouched to be at the boy's level. Can I talk to Mateo alone for a moment? He asked Jessica. She nodded, surprised by the request, but trusting him enough to grant it. I'll be by the tree in sight, she said, pointing to a nearby jacaranda. As she stepped away, Jessica watched Marcos talk to Mateo, their expressions serious and attentive. She saw her son nod occasionally, his shoulders gradually relaxing. When Marcos placed a hand on the boy's shoulder in an almost paternal gesture, she felt a wave of conflicting emotions, gratitude, fear, hope. Minutes later, Marcos called Jessica over with a gesture. Mateo now seemed calmer, even sporting a small smile. Everything okay? She asked, looking between them. Yes, Marcos replied. We just needed to clear up some man-to-man stuff. Man-to-man, Jessica repeated, raising an eyebrow. That's right, Mateo confirmed with seriousness, unconsciously mimicking Marcos's tone, about how to defend family without using fists. Family. The word resonated in Jessica's chest like a bell, awakening emotions she kept dormant for a long time. How about we grab something to eat? Marcos suggested. I think we all need to recharge after the scare. The restaurant Marcos chose wasn't one of the upscale places he frequented for business, but a small family-run fonda in Coacon with colorful plastic tablecloths and the best pozole in the area. I used to come here with my mom on Sundays, he explained as they sat by the window, when we could finally afford a small treat. The simplicity of the place, combined with its personal meaning for Marcos, touched Jessica. She was always surprised by how this man, who could afford the city's most exclusive restaurants, valued these authentic spaces, these connections to his roots. As they ate, Mateo gradually regained his usual cheer, recounting school anecdotes and asking about the buildings Marcos constructed. Can I visit one of your construction sites sometime? The boy asked, noisily sipping his hibiscus water. Of course, Marcos replied. In fact, we're finishing a special project I think you'll like, a community center with a library and spaces for art workshops. When can we go? Mateo insisted eagerly. This weekend. If your mom agrees, Marco said, looking at Jessica with an implicit question. Sounds good, she replied, as long as it doesn't interfere with your work. My work is exactly what you two have taught me these weeks, Marco said with a smile. Building things that make sense, that improve the lives of real people. Not just buildings, but spaces where life can thrive. The simplicity and depth of his words created a silent moment of connection between them, as Mateo happily tackled his second plate of pozole. That night, After putting Mateo to bed, Jessica found Marcos waiting in the small living room, looking pensive. "Thank you for today," she said, sitting beside him on the warm but clean sofa. "For being there, for talking to him, for everything." "You don't have to thank me, Jessica," Marcos replied, gently taking her hand. "It's what family does." The word, spoken for the second time that day, hung between them like a promise. "What did you tell him?" Jessica asked, curious about their private conversation. He looked so relieved afterward. Marcos smiled faintly. "I told him I completely understood his instinct to protect you," he explained. "That I felt the same if someone had spoken that way about my mother, but that truly strong men protect with their minds first and their fists only as a last resort." Jessica nodded, touched by the wisdom of his advice. "I also told him," Marcos continued, his voice slightly lower, "that I was proud of him, that defending his mother showed the kind of man he's becoming. He just needs to learn to channel it properly." "You told him you were proud," Jessica repeated, feeling an inexplicable emotion at those words. "Does that bother you?" Marcos asked, suddenly concerned. "I don't want to overstep, Jessica. I know I'm not." "It doesn't bother me," she interrupted, squeezing his hand. "It's just that Mateo's never had anyone say those words to him except me." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Jessica felt they were on the verge of a transformative conversation, one that would alter the course of their lives. "What are we, Marcos?" she asked finally, with a courage born of the day's events. "You told the principal you were my partner. Is that what we are?" Marcos looked at her with an intensity that took her breath away. "I want to be much more than that, Jessica," he replied honestly. "I want to be part of your lives, not as a Sunday visitor or a casual friend. I want to be there for the good days and days like today. I want to be family." "Are you sure?" she pressed. "You've seen what it involves, rumors, comments." "Comments will always exist," Marcos interrupted with conviction. "When I started my company, they said I was too young, too inexperienced, too much from Neswell Coil to succeed in a world of fancy last names. I survived that. Will survive this." Jessica felt her eyes well up. The certainty in Marcos' voice that will survive it united them against any adversity, broke through all her defenses. "I'm scared," she confessed in a whisper. "Not for me, for Mateo, if this doesn't work." "It will work," Marcos affirmed, moving closer. "Not because it's easy or because we won't face obstacles. It will work because we both know the value of fighting for what matters. Because neither of us gives up easily." Jessica looked at Marcos in silence, her heart pounding as she absorbed his words. Because neither of us gives up easily. It was true. Both have fought against difficult circumstances, building their lives by overcoming obstacles that would have defeated others. "It's not just my decision," she said finally. "Mateo has a say in this too." Marcos nodded, understanding the depth of what she was saying. "Of course. I'll respect whatever you decide together." At that moment, the sound of small footsteps interrupted their conversation. Mateo appeared in the living room doorway, in his dinosaur pajamas, looking sleepy. "I couldn't sleep," he murmured, rubbing his eyes. "I had a bad dream." Jessica opened her arms, and Mateo ran to her, curling up in her lap like when he was younger. "Want to talk about it?" she asked, stroking his hair. Mateo shook his head, but, after a moment of silence, spoke softly. "I dreamed Marcos left and never came back." The confession, so honest and vulnerable, created a charged silence. Jessica looked at Marcos, whose eyes reflected a mix of surprise and deep tenderness. "Mateo," Marcos said, leaning toward the boy, "do you remember the promise we made in Xochimilco? The pinky promise?" Mateo nodded, his eyes now fully awake and attentive. "Pinky promises are sacred," Marcos continued seriously. "And I promised we'd go back to look for axolotls, remember?" "Yes," Mateo replied, a small smile forming on his lips. "But I want to make you a more important promise now," Marcos said, extending his pinky again. "I promise I'll always be there for you and your mom, no matter what." Mateo looked at Marcos' extended pinky, then at his mother, as if seeking her approval. Jessica, with tears held back, nodded slightly. The boy hooked his small pinky with Marcos's in a solemn pact. Forever? Mateo asked. Forever, Marcos confirmed. Jessica watched the exchange, feeling something fundamental shifting in their lives. This wasn't an impulsive decision based on romance or convenience. It was a real commitment, born of mutual respect and a connection that had grown naturally between them. Now, I think someone should get back to bed, Jessica said, kissing her son's forehead. Can Marcos tell me a story? Mateo asked, surprising both adults. If your mom's okay with it, Marcos replied, looking at Jessica with an implicit question. Sounds perfect, she said, and the simple act of sharing the small bedtime routine felt like a significant step towards something new. As Marcos accompanied Mateo to his room, Jessica sat processing the day's events. Life had taken an unexpected turn since that night with 50 pesos in her wallet. Facing the humiliation of a failed date, what had begun as a stranger's kindness had transformed into something profound and true. Minutes later, Marcos returned to the living room, his expression softer than Jessica had ever seen. He fell asleep almost immediately, he said quietly. I told him about the first building I constructed. I thought he'd get bored, but he seemed fascinated. He absorbs everything you tell him, Jessica replied. You're like a window to a world he's never known. Marcos sat beside her, taking her hand gently. Jessica, there's something I want to show you, he said, pulling out his phone. The project I mentioned to Mateo, the community center. He showed her photos of a modern but welcoming building with large windows and integrated green spaces. It's beautiful, Jessica commented, genuinely impressed. It's in Iztapalapa, Marcos explained. 10 minutes from here. Jessica looked at him, intrigued by the coincidence. Why so close? Marcos took a deep breath before answering. Because I designed it thinking of you both, he confessed, of the possibilities, of the future together. Marcos, Jessica began, but he gently interrupted. Let me finish. I'm not suggesting you move or radically change your life. I just want to create something close to here, something that could be part of your community, something Mateo could visit after school for his art classes. The thoughtfulness and care of the gesture deeply moved Jessica. It wasn't an attempt to impress her with his power or wealth. It was a way of weaving his life with theirs, respecting their space and routines. There's more, Marcos continued, swiping through more images. On the top floor, there's a design studio. I equipped it with you in mind. Jessica held her breath as she saw photos of a bright space with work tables, state-of-the-art computers, and large windows overlooking a small indoor garden. Moon studio for your work, Marcos explained, so you can develop your own projects, not just the agencies. You have extraordinary talent, Jessica. You deserve a space to expand it. But I couldn't afford. It's a community incubator, he interrupted gently. The space is subsidized by the project's foundation. It's not a gift. It's an opportunity you've earned with your talent. Jessica looked at him, amazed by how Marcos understood her needs and dreams without her fully expressing them, how he respected her independence and pride even while offering new possibilities. I don't know what to say, she murmured finally. Don't say anything now, he replied. Visit it first this weekend with Mateo. Feel it. Imagine the possibilities. Then decide. Jessica nodded, overwhelmed by emotion, but there was something else she needed to know, something fundamental. Marcos, she began, searching for the right words. This is all wonderful, but I need to be sure. What are you really looking for with us? An instant family? To fill some void. The question was direct, even harsh, but necessary. Marcos seemed to appreciate her honesty. I'm looking for the same thing you are, Jessica, he replied calmly. A real love, a genuine connection, someone who sees me for who I am, not for what I have or represent. He paused before continuing. For years, I built buildings, companies, fortunes, but at the end of the day, I returned to an empty space. Not just physical loneliness, but the feeling that nothing I built had a true purpose, a reason beyond material success. Jessica listened intently, recognizing the vulnerability in his confession. With you and Mateo, Marcos continued, I feel like I'm building something meaningful, something real. I don't want an instant family. I want to be part of yours with patience, with respect, earning every day the place you let me occupy. His words resonated deeply with Jessica. There was no artifice in them, just the raw honesty that had characterized Marcos from the start. I have something for you, he said, pulling a small object from his jacket pocket. It's not what you think. In his palm rested a simple key. What is it? Jessica asked. The key to the studio, Marcos explained. It's not a marriage proposal or a way to pressure you. It's simply a space for you, for your talent, regardless of what you decide about us. Jessica took the key, feeling its symbolic weight. The center opens this Friday, Marcos continued. I'd love for you and Mateo to be there as my special guests. We'll be there, Jessica replied with a smile. One last thing, Marcos said, his expression suddenly more serious. Tomorrow, there's a meeting with the principal, Javier's parents, and us. I know, Jessica nodded, worry returning to her face. I don't know how to handle that situation without making it worse for Mateo. We'll go together, Marcos affirmed. And we'll make one thing very clear. We're a family, not perfect, not traditional, but a family that respects and protects each other. The firmness of his declaration, the natural way he spoke of them as a unit, dispelled Jessica's last doubts. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It was a recognition of what they'd already built in these months. A family, she repeated, testing the word, finding it right on her lips. Marcos leaned closer slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wanted. But Jessica didn't pull back. When their lips met for the first time, it was a tender kiss, a promise sealed without words. The next morning, as they ate breakfast together before the school meeting, Mateo watched them with a mix of curiosity and joy. Marcos, are you going to live with us now? He asked suddenly with the blunt honesty of children. Jessica and Marcos exchanged a glance, surprised by the question. Not for now, champ, Marcos replied calmly. But I'll be close, very close. And later, Mateo pressed. Later, Jessica interjected, taking Marcos' hand on the table. We'll build our future together, step by step, as a family. Mateo nodded, satisfied with the answer, and continued eating his cereal as if they'd just discussed the weather and not a fundamental shift in their lives. Later, as they walked to the school, Mateo in the middle holding both their hands, Jessica thought about the strange and wonderful path that had brought them here. A fancy restaurant, 50 pesos in her wallet, a date that never showed, and a man who had seen her, truly seen her, when she felt invisible. Life hadn't been easy, and it would likely continue to present challenges. But now they would face those challenges together, building not just buildings or designs, but a home, a true home where, as Marcos had said about his first construction, no one would get wet when it rained. When they arrived at the school, the principal greeted them with surprised expression at seeing them together as an unquestioned unit. Javier's parents, already present, observed them with poorly concealed curiosity. Before entering the office, Marcos paused and looked at Jessica and Mateo with a serene smile. Ready? He asked. Ready, Jessica replied, squeezing her son's hand. Mateo nodded with determination, standing a bit taller, unconsciously mimicking Marcos' confident posture. And so, together, they walked in to face whatever came, not as a single mother with her son and an occasional friend, but as what they truly were, a family that had begun in the most improbable way, with 50 pesos in a wallet and a millionaire watching from the next table, but now moved forward with the certainty of those who have finally found their true home.